All right, thank you everybody for joining us for another boot camp. This one is fairly specific. We're going to drill down into some of the workflow concepts, such as searching actions and the looping actions. Quite a bit there, so we'll get as deep as we can, but I want to make sure we split the time between the two sections because they're both very important, and they do work together quite a bit. That's one of the reasons why we put them together. One of the initial concepts that I want to talk about before we actually dig into the actual actions here is the concept of the active record and alternate record. You may have heard me talk about those at various times. What I want to do is just kind of dig in a little bit right at the beginning to explain what they are and how they relate to what we're going to be doing. All right, so let me just pull up a record here. Now, the active record, that's pretty straightforward. If you're looking at a record, this, for instance, is a vendor record. If you're looking at a record, it's pretty easy to say, okay, this is the active record. And by that, what I mean is anything that you do in this screen is going to apply to that record. If I edit the record, it's this record I'm changing. If I delete the record, it's this record I'm deleting. Okay, so it's easy in the UI to see this. There's a complementary concept in the workflow, which is the active record as well. So in workflow or in add-ins, the active record is the record that's currently being acted upon. So for instance, if I was to click this button up here, which is an add-in button, the actions for that add-in will operate on this record. Okay. Once again, seeing the button in the UI, it makes a pretty strong connection between the active record and whatever's happening with it. So when I click the button, the add-in knows to use this record as its active record to do all the work. So if I update values, if I do a merge template to a document, that kind of thing, they happen in this record. This is the active record. If you're in workflow and you route a record through workflow, whatever actions you do inside of that, the workflow actions, will also operate on that record that's being routed. That is your active record. So within a record screen, very obvious. If you do a search, see what I have here, a couple POs. If I was to run an add-in on these search results, there's two records now instead of one. So the first question is, okay, which one's the active record? The actual answer to that is neither one of them is the active record yet. But when I click a button and add-in, one of these add-ins up here to do something, what the search results does is it runs the add-ins on one record, then the next record, then the next, and it works its way through the results list and runs all the actions. So technically, no active record yet, but if I run something, it loads this one as the active record first, runs all the actions for that add-in. When it's all done, then it sets the second record as the active record and runs the same actions against that second record. Okay. So like I said, initially there is no active record, but as it runs through them, they each become active at a different time. And one at a time, they become the active record, all the actions happen on them. The toolbar add-ins, completely different concept. At this point, there's absolutely no active record. Even after I click one of these, even if I'm in a record screen, let's say I'm in here, load this record. Even if I click one of these now, even though the record is open, technically this is a toolbar add-in, so there is no record associated with them, which means there would be no active record. So if I tried to do like a merge template action, it would actually fail and would give me an error, basically saying there's no record available, because there is no active record for it to save that document into. Okay, so this is an important concept because later on, as we start dealing with search and run actions, now you're actually going to be searching and finding records and then running the actions on them. And then it becomes a little bit tougher to figure out, okay, which one's my active record? Because you're doing things from one record to another. So just wanted to point all this out and just explain to you that usually when you run actions, the first thing you want to make sure is you have the right record as your active record. Okay. And then there's another concept that we'll get into as we get into the actions, which is called the alternate record. And it'll make more sense for me to explain it when I'm actually showing you how the actions work. But just as the short description, an alternate record is another record you can have in memory that's not your active, but you can still get to it at the same time. So you can have actually two records in memory, an active and an alternate. And I'll show you how that works as we proceed forward. Now, to go along with all that, those concepts, you have under variable testing, this is a variable I put together, just amount is amount, right? And so if I run this and use the current record as my active record, and that's what this is doing, is basically setting the active record. If you've ever wondered what these data objects are in the testing panel, this is your active record. So now if I run this, I didn't have a record before, it gave me a blank. Now I run it, I have an active record, it gives me this record's value, the amount. Okay. And once again, if I get rid of my active record and run it, it'll just come back with nothing. Variable's a little bit more graceful. If you have no record, it just won't return data. And for later use, the alternate is down here, just so we'll get to that. Okay, so the active record is like, it's very important because that makes all the difference in the world on how the workflows and the add-ins all work. And as we dig into the looping, it'll become more obvious as to why I spent a couple minutes on it up front. All right, so let's get into some actions here. What I want to do is I'm going to talk about a couple scenarios and then we'll build an add-in for it. Okay, we'll start with one, we'll build an add-in, and then we'll just build on it to grow. So it's very common in the world of invoice processing that when an invoice is going through workflow, at some point you're going to want to take that, maybe a PO number that's in that invoice, and go look up a purchase order based on the PO number. So you would want to, at some point of the workflow, maybe validate that the purchase order is valid and that its amount is, sufficient to cover the invoice amount, whatever the rules are. But the big part of it is just searching for that purchase order. So I'm going to walk through that real quick. So I'm going to first make a quick invoice. Just going to throw one in there. Doesn't really matter. 1, 2, 3, 1, 2, 3. The big thing is it's $100. Purchase order number, Brad 1. Brad PO1. Let's do that. That's all I really need. Don't need to route it. So I'm just going to set up the environment here, create an invoice record with the purchase order number. Then I'm going to create a PO record with that same purchase order number. And then I'll walk you through setting up the add-in to go do that search to find the purchase order that matches the invoice. Okay. So here's an invoice. Now let's create the PO, same PO number. Maybe the PO was for $200, even though the invoice came in for $100. Oops. I want to put it in the right place. That's all I really need for now. Okay, so we have a purchase order and we have an invoice that points to that purchase order. But let's say the system has the data. Now you need to figure out, okay, how do I actually leverage that when I'm doing my work? So let's go to add-ins here. Okay, so let's just create one. Boot Camp, look up PO. Now, if you haven't created add-ins before, I'm not going to spend a lot of time on how to set these up. If you have any questions later on, let me know. I'm just going to make it a record add-in in this main screen, show it in the invoices. So the theory being here that you're in the invoice and you want to do a lookup from that to find the purchase order. Okay, you can do it the other way around if you need to, but that's the scenario we're working on now, is invoice to find the PO. So I'm going to have this add-in show up in the record screen for invoices. And the action will be, here's where we get into the fun stuff. Okay, if you type in the word search, you'll see a whole lot of search and whatevers, right? The main ones we use quite often, search and update, search and run action set, and search and run actions. Those are the three. And really now it's mostly become search and update and search and run actions, okay? The action set is very similar to the actions, and I'll talk a little bit more about those in a minute. What we're going to do is we're going to use a search and update to go find that purchase order, and we're going to pull back into my invoice, into the invoice record, the amount that the purchase order had in it. Okay, so we already know all the invoice information because the active record is the invoice. That's our active record. So if I use a variable, I'll just put it down here, like amount, that'll pull the invoice amount because the invoice is the current record. So the bracketed values will go to the active/current. We use them both synonymously here. The active record and grab its data values. So that's why the brackets are there. That means grab the amount value from the active record. Okay. So now, remember we are in that record, but now this is asking, okay, where do we want to search? Okay, I'll just say, okay, I want to search for POs. Where, come on. Just so I don't mistype, I'm going to select it where the PO number equals. Now I can use bracket values to grab the PO number that's in the invoice. Now, thankfully, they're spelled the same. The field name is the same on the purchase order side as it is on the invoice side. Makes it easier to remember. Okay, so this is saying go to the PO cabinet, find a record where PO number there equals the PO number in the active record, i.e. the invoice. Right. So this would be, it would basically be the exact same thing as you going to a search screen. Let me pull one over here. And you would go to PO and you would type in purchase order number, whatever's in the invoice. Same search. You're just doing it programmatically here. Okay? Now the advanced search has some advanced options. We're going to skip over that for now because that's really not relevant, but you could do some more with that. So this is telling me what to search for. Then when I find something, what do I want to update? Now, first thing it's going to ask you is which record are you updating? The active record, which we talked about, or the found records? Now, right now, we're just going to stick with the active records. We'll come back and talk about the other, but that's another question I get quite a bit. Because you can push data to the records you found instead of pull it. Okay, but for now, we're going to pull. So we're pulling data. What do we want to do? Okay, so this is saying update field. I want to pull data back from the invoice, from the PO record into my invoice. Okay, so I'm going to call the field. I'm just going to make a field up to PO amount. Okay, so I already have an amount field that has my invoice value. Now I want to make another field called PO amount, and I'm going to put the value of the purchase order, that amount. And if I remember right, let me go to POs. I think it's just amount as well, but I'm going to verify here. Yep, it's amount. Okay, so set the PO amount in the invoice equal to amount on the PO. Now, notice something here. Remember back here, I said that the bracketed value comes from the active record, the purchase order PO number that's in the invoice record, right? Because that's the active record is invoice. But once you do that search and you found a record, a purchase order, in this panel, the purchase order is now the active record, if you will. So you refer to its values using the square brackets. Now, this is a little bit different than a lot of places in our system, but you kind of flip the roles just momentarily while you're doing the update. You're saying, okay, now grab me the amount of the record I found and put it into my PO amount field, my invoice. Okay, so that one confuses people quite often. But just remember that if you use square brackets here, it just flips roles momentarily while you're grabbing that data. So now, what I did here, I searched for a PO number that matches mine, and I'm pulling back the amount of the PO and putting it into the PO amount field in my invoice. So let me save that. Brad PO1, perfect. Okay, so now we have this new button up here, look up PO. Boot Camp, look up PO. That's what we just created. So if I click that, now before I click it, I'm going to look at my raw data here. I have an amount, I have a PO number, but I don't have a PO amount. Okay, that doesn't exist. But if I click that button, it's going to do the search for the purchase order, find it, pull back its amount. After it refreshes, I'm going to do another edit, go back to raw, and there's your PO amount. So we just successfully pulled back the amount from the purchase order record into this record. Now, the reason we do this a lot is now we have the invoice going through workflow. Imagine this being workflow driven instead of button driven by the add-in, right? The invoice comes in, we do all of the index scraping with machine learning, we get the PO number, due dates, all that stuff, beautiful. The next step after index, we might say, if there's a purchase order number, go into this action and do a search for the purchase order, pull back that PO amount. Now, I should say, before we go too far, had we not found a PO record, then this would not be here. The PO amount field would be empty. So you could check for that as well in workflow. The PO amount is blank. Stop here. We didn't find a PO, that kind of thing. But now we can actually pull that data into the invoice record. Now we have a PO amount. And then you could have another trigger that maybe says, okay, if the PO amount in the invoice is less than the invoice amount, then the invoice is more than the purchase order is worth. So that could be a red flag. Maybe we stop it for review, something like that. It's also common for them for people to do a percentage buffer on that. Well, okay, if it's $105, that's fine. If it's 5% plus or minus, let it through. We could do that as well with our calculated values. But just knowing how to get that data and pull it from the purchase order into the invoice, that's step one. Because now you've got that data. Now you can look at it and compare and figure out what to do. Okay. So that's what the search and updates, the power of the search and update is to be able to pull data back and forth, pull and push, if you will. Let's take it one step further. What if instead of pulling data from the purchase order into the invoice, another scenario with this type of processing might be that every time an invoice comes in for a purchase order, we might want to update the purchase order with how much came in for that invoice. So maybe you have an invoice total amount in the purchase order. And every time another invoice comes in for that PO, we subtract the amount of that invoice from the purchase order's amount. So we kind of get a running total of how much is left on that purchase order. So we can keep decrementing it. And if it gets below zero, we can send it off to another workflow for somebody to review. Okay, now the purchase order doesn't have any more money left in it, whatever. So you can kind of use the same mentality. The invoice is coming through. As it's coming through, maybe you would do a check like this to make sure the PO exists, make sure that it had enough money on it, whatever. And then if everything looks good, then you can have another action that reverses it, do the same search to find the PO, but go the other way. Okay, flip it. Now I'm not updating the invoice, I'm updating the purchase order. Okay, so maybe we have a field called remaining amount in the purchase order. And I want to take that remaining amount. I'm going to do this, and then I'll come back and make it work. If anybody's watching, they'll know I'm doing this wrong. Remaining amount minus the amount of the invoice. And you'll have to do a math around that. So it computes math. So you could say the remaining amount of the purchase order, maybe it starts out as the same as the amount. And then every invoice that comes through, we just take that remaining amount minus the invoice amount, and now you've got a new remaining amount. Let me click on this little edit button so we can see it all at one time. If you haven't seen that feature, by the way, we added that a couple of releases ago, where if there's any text in the field, you just click the edit button and we can get a bigger view. So this would work with one exception. Remaining amount is in the purchase order. The amount came from the invoice, but they both have square brackets, which means that it's going to look in the same record, and they're not in the same record. Okay, and this is where it starts getting a little hairy, so I'm going to walk through slowly. But when the action is updating the found record, then the bracketed value is the invoice, the current, the active record. Okay, the bracketed amount stays the active record. If you want to get to the data from the alternate record, and this is where we're going to start talking about alternate records, just do one slight change. And inside the square brackets, put angle brackets. Okay, so square brackets means grab a value from the active record. The square with angle brackets around it means grab a value from the alternate record. And in this case, since we're updating the found records, those found records are the alternates. And the invoice that you came from is the active. I know that's a little weird. This toggle down here actually flips the context. That's what we call a context. The current context is now this one's active and this one's alternate. If you flip that context, then they reverse their roles. Okay. So anyway, what happens is then, if you look at this, now update the found record, the PO, set its remaining amount equal to its remaining amount minus my invoice amount. Gets a little weird. But then when we get into the looping part of it, we'll use this even more. So that's why I like to focus a little bit on this now. Now, this scenario actually comes up quite a bit where we will decrement counters. We've done inventory control processes before, where every time an order comes through, we can first verify there's enough quantity on hand by looking at the inventory record type based on the part number. If there isn't, we queue the invoice up or the order up to be fulfilled. Orders have to come in first before it can be fulfilled, that kind of thing. And once the order is actually packaged, then we can go decrement the quantity on hand on the invoice records. And then we can even have a follow-up action that goes through all of the invoice records, and anything that has a reorder quantity that's being met, we can shell out a reorder for that part number, that kind of thing. But that all stems from just being able to read and write those values from an order that comes in, comparing it to the inventory. So that's where the search and update can help you just across the board in so many scenarios. And you can update multiple fields too, both ways. So I could update the remaining amount, the last invoice number, the whatever you want. Now, if you need to update both the invoice and the purchase order, there's a couple options. One, you could actually just copy this search and update. And then this one updates the PO, this one updates the invoice. Okay, that would do 2 searches essentially, but it would accomplish the same thing. The other thing we can do, and I'll talk about this in a minute, is we can actually wrap this in a search and search and run actions. Okay, so I'll just queue that one up for a minute because we can actually do that a little bit more efficiently with a search and run action. So the search and run actions, I've already got one built, so we'll pull that one open. It's very much like the search and update, except the search is the same. Search and the advanced search, those are identical. But instead of actually updating one thing or the other, it's not built to just update. It's built to just do other things. So I could say the same kind of concept. I could say search for that invoice. This is actually a vendor search. Let me go back to this one here. Look up PO. I'm going to just redo this one with a search and update. Rather than a search and update with a search and run action. So if we didn't want to do it this way, let's just go right into it. Let's do a search and run actions. So the same search, go to the PO, where PO number equals active records PO number, i.e. the invoices record number. And instead of just doing a direct update, we will add some actions. Well, the first action would probably be an update. And I want to update now let's just make sure that we're doing the same thing here. I think the last thing I ended up with just the PO amount to amount. Okay, so once again, I'm just going to grab the PO amount from the purchase order amount. Okay, this is slightly different though, because whereas the search and update does an automatic context switch where it knows which one you're looking at, with the search and run action, you have to tell it specifically what you're doing at every step of the action. So right now, when we first started the search, the active record is the invoice. Okay, so you're routing the invoice, trying to do a lookup for the PO. That's pretty straightforward. After the search happens, though, for each record in the search, it runs these actions. So if it finds 2 purchase orders, it's going to run twice. It's going to loop through twice. For every record it finds, those found records are the active record at that point. Okay, so now when we're actually running actions inside of this search and run whatever, search and run actions, search and run action sets, inside this loop, the actions are actually running under the context of the records you found. So kind of like when you run the add-in from the search results screen, you click the button that goes record by record and runs those actions, same concept. The actions are running in the context of the found records. So I found a PO, and I want to update the invoice's purchase order amount with the amount from the PO. Now, here's the quandary. The record field update is going to look at the active record and try to update it. Well, the active record is the purchase order. We don't want to update the purchase order. We want to update the invoice. Well, when the invoice came in, that was the active record. As soon as you do the searching, the purchase order is now the active record, and the record you came from, the invoice, automatically becomes your alternate record. So in all of these loops and all these search ands, the record that initiated it becomes your alternate. So the purchase order now is the active, and the alternate is your invoice. So all you have to do is just go to the options on this record field update and tell it to update the alternate record. And you might have seen this option before and not quite known how to use it, or maybe saw it on and confused you. That's what it's for. So when we first come in, invoice is active, we don't have an alternate. We haven't found anything yet. As soon as the search happens, the purchase order is the active, the invoice becomes your alternate. I want to update that invoice. I want to update that alternate. Set its PO amount field equal to the amount of the active record, which is your purchase order. So,
Brad, when you do the search and update, does it also do an update to all the found records, or just the first record found?
Only if you do the found records, it'll do all of them.
Got it.
If you do the active record, and that's a great question because, and this does come up, if you're searching and you're updating just the active record, then it's only going to find the first one. You can only update from one other record. But if you're updating the records you found, it will update all of them up to a certain point. I can't remember if there's a configuration for that. Max number of records. Here we go. So you could say, give me the first 100 that match. Okay. Good question, though. All right. So, like I said, once you get into the search and whatever, so search and run some things. Like I said, in this tab, it's the easiest way for me to remember. In this tab, my invoice is active, the active record. In this tab, my invoice is the alternate record. Okay, it automatically puts it in that other spot for me so I can work on the purchase orders and still deal with the invoice. With that little flag right there. So this, what we just did here, we'll do the exact same thing as a search and update. With one slight variation. If there's more than one purchase order, it'll actually run through twice, but hopefully that never happens. You can catch that too if you need to. You could do that. Just set this to 1, just in case there's more than one. Okay. But you can see though, the other thing is the search and update just kind of does one thing. It's really for updating only. With the actions, I could do other stuff. So for instance, let's say I wanted to do that scenario. I want to grab the PO amount, put it in the invoice, but I also want to decrement the purchase order at the same time. Okay, and I can't remember what we called that, but let's call it remaining amount. I think that's what we called it. So let's say I want to update the purchase order now. So that one has actually the active record. So this toggle is correct right out of the gate. Okay, set the purchase order's remaining amount equal to, I'll just copy, I'm a horrible typist, current records remaining amount minus the amount of the invoice. Now this is where you have to use your alternate. Because the invoice, remember, is the alternate record now. So take the remaining amount from the purchase order and take away the amount from the invoice and put that into the active records, because we haven't turned on alternate, remaining amount field. So now, instead of having to do 2 searches to update one for the invoice, one for the purchase order, I can do them both at the same time, much more efficient. Because they're both in memory, it just sets the values on both and then saves on the way out. So we did both at the same time. You're looping through, you got the invoice in memory, you found the PO, you might as well do them both at the same time. Update the invoice here with the alternate, update the PO here with the active. It's just a matter of knowing when to use the angle brackets versus the square brackets. Okay. Let me save this. Now, looking at all this, a lot of times we'll want to test some of this with the variable tester. Remember, I talked about how you can do this. Here's your active record, and then here's your alternate. So for instance, if I wanted to go find that purchase order, let's go find that I just added. I should have remembered its record ID. There's the record ID for the purchase order. And this is actually the invoice right now, right? So yeah, invoice. So I could say that my alternate is my purchase order, my active is my invoice, and now I can start playing with both of those things. And then I could do PO amount is the alternate amount. So once you kind of get that concept down, the active versus alternates, you can actually start doing all this testing, because I prefer to use a testing panel to get all my logic out first. You know, I'll skeleton out the workflow or the action set or whatever kind of in skeleton form of kind of how I want to progress through it. But then I'll use the testing panel with some real records and do things like this, so I make sure I'm getting everything right. And then if I go into a loop and need to swap them, I just go over here and change this to 95 or whatever. And this one does. Let's go ahead and do another search and update that updates the ones that are found. I was like that question we had a second ago. What happens if you find other ones? I'll do the same thing here. And then I think for this scenario, I'll go to the vendor record and find all the invoices for that vendor. So I think these are all related. I might be able to jump to my vendor here. Here we go. So, and a lot of times the UI relation stuff helps a lot in these testing as well. So I have a vendor ID of 2221. So I can actually run an add-in from the vendor from here to find all of the invoices for this vendor and update them with something. So let me do a real quick search here to find all those invoices manually. And that's vendor ID, what was it, 2221? Yeah, 2222. There we go. Okay, there's 3 invoices. And maybe I'll set their batch ID with something just for fun. So what I'll do is, let's do a search. So theory is from a vendor record, you want to go find all the invoices of that vendor and do something to them, update them with a value. So I'm just going to do a search and update. And I'll reverse the logic a little bit, where I'm going to search for invoices where the vendor ID equals, what is the vendor's field name? ID. Well, there's a difference. Okay. There we go. So wherever the vendor ID of the invoice equals the ID of the vendor record I'm in right now, and I want to update those batch IDs. And I'm assuming it's batch ID. Never assume. There we go. Okay. I'll say Brad was here. Okay. So find all of those invoices and update them and say Brad was here. Now, I didn't give a limit on the max number of records. I believe the maximum default is 200. If you're going to be updating a lot of records, we should probably talk about doing offline processing or long-running process stuff. But you know, for a couple, 3 records, it's no big deal. So, I didn't put anything on there, did I? Boot camp what? Just the boot camp updates, invoices from vendor. Okay. All right, so now if I go to my vendor record, I should have an add in. There we go. Oh, no, that's not the right one, is it? Refresh. I don't even know if I specified where to do that. Search update invoices from vendor. Hang on. Put it in the wrong place. Vendors. There we go. Let's go back to our vendor record. There we go. Update invoices from vendor. Now, once again, before I do that, let me just do another search. Okay, no batch IDs. Perfect. Okay. So we run this. Okay, now I'll just do my search again. And no batch ID. Okay, what did I do wrong? Search for invoices where vendor ID equals my ID. And that was 2221. I can actually do a test search here. Oh, I didn't find any. Let me look. See what that field name is. Maybe I picked the wrong field name. And the invoice itself. That's the big one. Vendor ID. Invoices for vendor 12.21. That looks right. Okay, so that's right. Update the act. Oh, there we go. Forgot the toggle. So actually updated the invoice or the vendor record. So if I actually go look at the vendor record, refresh that, because I didn't toggle it, update the wrong thing. Yep, there it is. Get rid of that. Don't want that in the vendor record. Okay. Now let's do that again. Go to my last search. There we go. So there we did a search and we pushed the data rather than pulling the data. I wanted to just give a demo of both of them so you can see. When you're pushing, you can push up to several at the same time. When you're pulling, you can only pull from one into that record. If you need to do multiples, then you could do just the search and run actions, and you could deal with it that way. Because sometimes you might want to pull back all of these amounts and put it into a field in the vendor table. Who knows? Typically, they'd be the other way around, but you never know. So it's all possible. All right. So let's think about another scenario. Okay. So I think I have a record built for this one because sometimes it takes a while to build it up. In this scenario, I have a record purchase order. And this time, instead of putting the PO number in the invoice, which I think we did too, we also put the invoice number in the PO records, multiples. So it can be 1, could be 2, could be 10. We don't know. But the scenario would be, we're going to look at this purchase order. We want to go out and find all of the invoices that are associated with this purchase order and do something. Pull back the invoice amount. Maybe that's another scenario where we want to go back and reconcile how many invoices came through, look at their amounts, compare it to PO amount. But we want to do it from the other way. Instead of every time an invoice comes in, we update the PO, maybe later on we go from the PO and go find everything and pull it this way. So similar, but a whole different philosophy. So let's look at this case. Let's use looping. So I'm going to say boot camp loop from PO to invoice. So I'm going to show this one in the purchase order record type. Go. Now here we're going to use a loop. Now there's a lot of different kinds of loops. There's action loop, which is kind of your open-ended, just loop through and do a whole bunch of stuff for whatever reason, which we might just use that here. There's a document loop where you can look in the active record, or maybe not. I guess you can, yeah, this is active record. Some of them are, some of them aren't, so I had to look. look at the active record and loop through its documents that match the criteria and do something for each one. Loop through all the line items in the record, loop through a table. You can actually look through a CSV file in a record and loop through all of its lines. And then you can even loop through annotations. That's a new one we added a couple of releases ago for actually being able to do annotation manipulation. So, all right, so in this case, I'm just going to do a generic loop. I'm going to say, okay, I need to loop through all of the invoice numbers in this purchase order and go do something with them. We'll worry about what we're going to do later. Now let's just kind of set this up. Now, looping takes a couple different elements. One, it has to know how many times you want to loop. You got to figure that out first, and we'll get to that in a second. Then, when I'm looping, what do you want to do inside? Okay, which is a lot like the search and run actions, but instead of searching, it's just a loop and run actions. Think of it that way. If you're going to loop, and this is an enterprise feature, by the way, doesn't work on standard. If you're going to loop, you need to tell it how many times. I could just do this, loop 10 times and do something, and that would work just fine. Except if there's only 2 invoices to find, what am I going to do with the other 8 times in the loop? All right. So what we need to be able to do is find how many elements are available. How many invoices do we have in that purchase order? Okay. So if I look at that purchase order, we have 2. We need to see it and know it, but we have to programmatically find it. So I'm going to do a shift F1 here to go to my variables so I can show you this. Okay. There is, and I think it's under record variables, actually, sorry. So you can actually get a field count. It'll tell you how many fields in the record match this field name. So I'm going to use that one. I'm going to put that here. And all I need to do is change field name equal to whatever that invoice field name is. I think it's just invoice, yeah. Okay. So this is going to return back the number of fields in the current record that have the name invoice. I can test that, which I like to do a lot. Go to my variable tester, set that as my active record, this one. Put that in there and it should tell me 2. Yeah. So it found 2. So this is going to loop 2 times. Now, what do we want to do? Okay, let's say we want to update the current record, the active record, the PO. We want to update, let's do that remaining amount again. Okay. Now this gets a little trickier because right now, what we know about it is we just know we have 2 items. We don't know what to do with them. So I'm going to keep this here, but I'm going to add another field up above it. Just to make it easier, I'm going to do something here. I'm going to show you how you can use these variables. So what happens is the action loop initiates. It says how many times you want to loop. It'll run this on the active record. And in this case, it'll bring back 2. So it knows right now I'm going to run 2 times. Each time it runs, it sets a variable behind the scenes called loop action counter. Okay. Now loop action counter will tell you what loop number you're in, so you can use that as a variable in your actions. Okay. So I could, if I wanted to, I could set this invoice counter as a variable in the current record and just update it to the loop number, okay, which doesn't really do much good. But along with this field count, there's actually a field delimited, or in this case, a rec data, which is what we want. Now, record data will tell you back, you basically say, it's the easiest way to get back the value from that specific number on loop action counter. So tell you what, let me do it here first so I can show you. Okay. Record data, give me the invoice data separated by, now we're only going to do 1, so it doesn't have to be separated by anything. Okay. And line num is going to be our, let's just say 1. Hang on a second, I got to look that up. I always do this. Yeah, that's the one. I always grab the wrong one. I keep talking and I grab the wrong one every time. Instead of rec data, it's field delimited. Field count, field delimited. I should know that by now. Okay. So I want to get back the first field named invoice. There you go. Now the second one named invoice will bring back B. So I named them A and B so I can easily tell which one's which. Okay. So what we can do is we can use this variable, but instead of using a number 1 hard-coded in there, replace it with this. Now, the first time it runs through, this invoice will be set to the A version, that first one. The second time it loops, this will resolve to a number 2, which will bring back the second invoice number. So I do this at the beginning of my loop so that I have one variable that I can use down below called this invoice for everything and not have to do this every time. Because you put enough of these variables in there and it gets a little hard to read. So I like to make it shorter on myself. So this invoice is equal to loop number 1, that'll be the A version. So now we're gonna have a variable called this invoice that will have that first invoice number in the first loop. Now we know the invoice number. What else do we want to do? Well, this is where we start combining some of these actions that we've been using. So now we know what invoice to go find. Now we got to go find it. So let's do a search and update. I'm going to search in the invoices, their invoice number, and I'm simplifying this by not putting in vendor name and all that stuff because you probably would limit it by vendor as well. Okay. Go search in the invoices where invoice number equals this invoice, which is the first one up here, right? And then if I find it, I can do whatever I want. I'm going to update the active record. Once again, I'm going to say remaining amount, doing the same kind of thing as we did before. Math remaining amount minus amount, and I'll deal with the alternates here in a second. Okay, so I'm updating the active record, which means that which is the PO, because I'm running this from the PO. Then, or that's from the vendor, actually. Did I say PO? I should have been vendor, shouldn't I? No, this is PO, sorry. Boy, I got myself all confused there. All right, make sure, maybe we are in a PO, right? Yep, perfect, okay. So we're going from the PO. So the active record is the PO on the way in, but since we're updating that active record, it flips it. So remaining amount for the PO is the alternate, and the amount is the record we found, which would be the invoice. Okay. So the first time through, it'll find the invoice, it'll update the purchase order, take the remaining amount minus the amount of the invoice. Everything's fine. Then it loops again on loop number 2. Now it gets a different invoice number, the B one, and it takes the remaining amount down again based on that other invoice number, amount. Now, if I actually got that right in the first crack, I'll be surprised. We'll see. So once again, looping through the number of invoice numbers we found, just remembering the invoice number, it's easier for me to keep track of it. So that's why I like to recommend this. And then go find that invoice and decrement your remaining amount in your PO. So let's look at this real quick here. I want to look at the data. So right now we have an amount of $3,035.88. I'm going to simplify this a little bit. I'm going to make it $5,000 in my PO. Let's go to those invoices. I'm going to update each of those so we can do math easier. What do we have in this one? Okay, let's make that easier. 1,000. Okay, and this one, make this 2,000. Oh, let's just do that. Okay, there we go. Fresh. There we go, 1,000 and 2,000. So theoretically, what I want to do is I want to start out the remaining amount with the same as the amount is here. So I'm going to add a field called remaining amount. Set that to 5,000 as well, if I can spell. There we go. There. All right, so when we click this button, if everything works, we should have a remaining amount that comes out that will be, what, 2,000 after the 3,000 taken away? Let's try it. That was the last invoice number. There's your remaining amount, $2,000. Actually worked this time. Thank you, thank you. If you look at what we're doing here, it really have been doing kind of the same thing, but just taking different approaches. At this one, you can use a loop. I'm still doing the same decrement remaining amount, but you could do all sorts of things. And I can't even count the number of ways we've used loops before in the past. We have a couple of solutions where we have to loop through all the line items, and for each one of those, go out to another record and update it based on the line item data. You can use one was, for instance, GL coding at the line item level. We would actually go out and find the GL code that was mapped to and verify data, pull back other data based on that. All sorts of things you could do with it using that one's a line item. This is just a regular action. Let me look at this. This one we use a lot. These two, not as much. So really the biggest ones are going to be action loop and your line item loop for the most part. Table loop, you can actually do that from let's say somebody saves an e-form, you can loop through that table and do all sorts of things based on the data in the table. One thing I do want to point out though, before we go too far, well, we're almost done actually, but before I get done here, is that there's also, if you look at any action type, there's also a loop on every action type. It's not just in the looping actions. You can actually loop in every action. So I could, if I wanted to, I could do something similar to this. Let me grab this again. For each invoice I find, right, do the same loop. And I'm going to grab this right here, since I don't have to type it again. And I'm going to, oh, let's just say an email. I'm going to send myself an email. Oh, great, that's coming on the internet now. Invoice number, and this would be loop action counter, is there. So what'll happen is I'll get two emails. This first one will be invoice one is, get out of this here. Invoice number one is, and then the body would be whatever the invoice number is. And the next email I get with the invoice number two is, you get the idea. So I can loop a single action and run it multiple times. Now that's not as common. Typically you want to do more than just one thing, but if you find out that you're just doing a single thing multiple times in a loop, feel free to just put the action out here and do it yourself as a loop itself. It'll work the same way. And once again, like I said, if you're running standard version, none of that is available to you. It has to be enterprise. Let me look here just to make sure I've covered all my bases. The line item loop, I guess I could go through that. We've got a few minutes left, but really the line item loop is the same. This is the last thing on my list here. If you'll notice on all the looping, by the way, in the loop action, the action loop has a loop action counter variable. Okay, that's the variable you use to refer to that loop in the whole thing. Now, if you're looping a single item, it has a different variable name called loop counter. Now, loop action counter, it's a loop counter, which means it's just for that inner loop. So you could actually loop inside of a loop. So I could have done this update 5 times. Okay, loop counter refers to this loop. Loop action counter refers to the outer loop. Okay? And every loop type has its own variable. So for line item loops, it's line counter. So as you're doing things for every line item, it's a line counter variable you would use. If you're doing things for a document counter, I believe that's doc counter is the loop. Document doc counter. There you go. So pay attention to the text up above. Not only does it tell you the name, but it's easy just to copy and paste, so you don't have to mistype something down below. I'm a big proponent of that. And the other loops, table row, I think that's row counter. Yeah, there you go, row counter. Now, I know that's a lot of information to throw in an hour. There's actually a lot to it. But the biggest thing that I want you to take away from this is the concepts of the active and the alternate records. Okay, that's the thing that if you get that down pat, all the loops and all of the search and whatever's will be so much simpler. Okay, it'll make so much more sense. And then using the right variable at the right time, it does take some practice and you got to play with it. Remember to use that variable tester at the top under your admin section. That'll help you a lot just on getting what's right. And then the other thing is, if you're going to use this stuff in workflow, test it with an add-in first, right? Build a couple tests inside of the add-in interface because it's so much easier than trying to route things and then go back and look at the record after the route. With an add-in, you can have it pop up an exception that shows you the value. You can have it write it to the record. It's so much simpler just to play with add-ins than it is to do it through workflow. And if you're going to do it that way, you might as well go ahead and build an action set that does things. Because then you can call it from an add-in or from a workflow, and it works the same way. As long as the active record is the same when you start things out, it'll work the same.